two of the most recognizable names in Black church leadership. Two viral moments, weeks apart. And a question a lot of people online have been asking without much evidence to back it up: is one pastor using his pulpit to throw shade at another, to change the subject from questions about his own house? That's the theory floating around, and I want to be straight with you before we go one sentence further. A theory is not a fact. So today, instead of repeating what a YouTube commentary channel said happened, we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to lay out what is actually documented: court filings, church financial disclosures, on-record statements. And then, we're going to talk honestly about what's speculation, what's fair criticism, and what's just internet noise dressed up as investigation. If you've seen the video going around about Bishop T.D. Jakes' sermon and Bishop Marvin Winans, stick with me. I think you'll walk away from this with a clearer picture than that video gave you. Let's set the table. Because a lot of commentary videos assume you already know the backstory. If you don't, the rest won't land. Thomas Dexter Jakes, Bishop T.D. Jakes, built the Potter's House in Dallas from a congregation of about 50 families who relocated with him from West Virginia in the mid-1990s into one of the largest and most influential churches in the country. He bought the property from a previous televangelist, W.V. Grant, who had been convicted of tax evasion, which is a detail worth sitting with, because it means the ground Potter's House sits on has a history of financial scrutiny before Jakes ever arrived. Jakes became a genuine media empire, not just a preacher. Books, films, a record label, conferences drawing crowds in the tens of thousands. A relationship with 2 U.S. presidents, eulogies for Whitney Houston and Aretha Franklin. Time magazine put him on its cover and asked whether he was the next Billy Graham. And here's the detail: a lot of the "is he hiding something" videos either skip past or bury. In July 2025, Jakes actually stepped down as senior pastor. In a nearly 4-hour installation service, he handed the pulpit to his daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts, and her husband, Tour Roberts. Jakes stayed on as chairman of the church's leadership board and took on a role described as spiritual overseer, and he continues to chair the T.D. Jakes Group, which includes his real estate, media, and foundation ventures. That's a meaningfully different position than senior pastor, delivering the Sunday message every week, so any claim built on his sermon last week needs to be checked against who's actually preaching now. Now, Marvin Winans. If Jakes is a media empire, Winans is gospel music royalty. Part of the legendary Winans family, his siblings Bebe and Cece Winans are gospel institutions in their own right. Marvin built his career as a singer before founding Perfecting Church in Detroit in 1989. He's still leading it today. And for almost 2 decades, that church has been trying to finish building a permanent home on Woodward Avenue near 7 Mile, a project approved back in 2004 that has been stop and start ever since. In 2023, the city of Detroit actually filed a lawsuit against Perfecting Church and Winans personally, citing the unfinished construction site as a public nuisance. That's the real, documented backdrop. Now let's talk about what actually happened this fall. In October 2025, Perfecting Church held its annual Day of Giving, a fundraising service meant to help finally finish that Woodward Avenue building. Winans asked congregants for a specific structure. He described it as 1,000 plus 1,000, meaning 2 separate $1,000 contributions. People lined up to announce their gifts publicly from the pulpit, largest donations first. A church member named Roberta McCoy came forward and announced she was giving $1,235 in faith, as she put it, and said she'd bring the rest later. Winans, on camera, corrected her in front of the congregation, telling her that wasn't what he'd asked for. That clip spread fast. Within a day, it had racked up massive engagement, and the criticism was pointed. Commentators online called it tone-deaf, ministerial arrogance, exploitative given how many people are struggling financially right now. Some pointed to the 20 years of delayed construction and asked, fairly, why a congregation should keep pouring money into a building that still isn't done 2 decades later. Here's the part a lot of the reaction videos leave out, though, because it doesn't fit the narrative as cleanly. Both Winans and McCoy later spoke publicly and said the video had been taken out of context, that it was a misunderstanding about the giving tiers, not a public shaming. McCoy said Winans personally apologized to her afterward and said she's remained a member of the church since 2013 and intends to keep giving. That doesn't erase the original discomfort a lot of viewers felt watching the clip. Public financial pressure in a worship setting is a legitimate thing to be uncomfortable with, but it does complicate the predatory pastor framing that a lot of channels ran with in the first 48 hours. So what do we actually know here? We know Perfecting Church has a genuinely long, documented history of construction delays and a real 2023 nuisance lawsuit from the city. We know the fundraising ask was public and, by design, made individual giving amounts visible to the whole congregation, which is its own conversation about church culture and financial pressure, separate from whether Winans was personally malicious in that one moment. And we know both people involved say the clip doesn't tell the whole story. That's a very different, more complicated picture than pastor humiliates poor woman for money, which is how a lot of the commentary flattened it. Now let's turn to Jake's, because this is where a lot of these commentary videos get loose with the word allegations, throwing around names and claims without being precise about what's actually documented versus what's a single person's assertion. Let's start with something boring but important: nonprofit financial transparency. Churches in the U.S. have a unique legal status. They're not required to file the standard IRS Form 990 that other nonprofits file, which means the public doesn't automatically get to see their budgets, salaries, or spending the way we can with, say, the Red Cross or a university. The watchdog organization Ministry Watch, which grades religious nonprofits on financial transparency, lists T.D. Jake's Ministries, operating as a doing business as name under the Potter's House of Dallas, as a ministry that has chosen not to share detailed financial information with them. Ministry Watch is upfront that this doesn't mean something is wrong. It means it's difficult for outside donors to independently verify how money moves through the organization. They note Jake's conferences alone have drawn crowds as large as 52,000 people, a meaningful share of them not regular members of the church, which tells you the financial footprint here is genuinely large, whatever you think about how it's managed. This is a structural point, not a personal scandal. Most large American megachurches operate this way. Potter's House is not uniquely secretive by megachurch standards. It's just large enough that its finances matter to a lot of people, and opaque enough by design that outsiders can't fully audit it. If a commentary video is implying Jake's uniquely hides money in a way other megachurch leaders don't, that's not well supported by what's publicly documented. If the claim is the general opacity of megachurch finance should concern donors, that's a much more defensible point, and one worth actually sitting with instead of turning into a personality-driven call-out. Separately, Jake's has faced criticism for decades over lifestyle, expensive homes, designer clothes, private planes for ministry travel, which critics link to prosperity gospel-style teaching. That criticism is old, it's well documented in mainstream religion reporting going back to the early 2000s, and it's a legitimate theological and ethical debate that a lot of scholars and other pastors have weighed in on. It is a different category of claim than fraud or criminal wrongdoing, and treating he lives well and he's hiding a crime as the same accusation is exactly the kind of blur that makes this content misleading. This is the part of the story that gets treated most carelessly online, so I want to slow down here. In early 2024, Jake's was briefly named in a civil lawsuit filed against music mogul Sean Diddy Combs by a former associate of Combs. The claim in that filing was that Combs had allegedly planned to use his relationship with Jake's to help repair his public image amid separate, serious allegations against Combs himself, allegations of abuse and trafficking that are well documented elsewhere. Jake's was not accused of wrongdoing in that filing. He was named as someone Combs allegedly intended to use for reputational cover. That's an important distinction that a lot of thumbnail-driven content collapses. Later in 2024, a minister named Dwayne Youngblood said in a podcast interview that Jake's had groomed and sexually assaulted him when he was a teenager, decades earlier. Youngblood's brother, Richard Youngblood, subsequently came forward with similar claims. Reporting on this has noted a third individual, Timothy Anderson, also came forward with allegations. Here's what's important to say clearly. These are serious, disturbing allegations, and they deserve to be taken seriously. Survivors coming forward about powerful religious leaders is a pattern this country has seen before, and dismissing it out of hand would be irresponsible. At the same time, being precise matters just as much as taking it seriously. As of this recording, these are allegations made in interviews and public statements, not findings from a criminal conviction or a completed civil judgment. Jakes has denied the claims. No verdict exists establishing them as fact, and no verdict exists disproving them either. That's simply where the public record currently sits. Serious, credible sounding, unresolved, any video, including the one that likely brought you here, that states these claims as settled fact, or garbles the names and details, isn't doing you a service. And any framing that treats someone made an allegation as automatically equivalent to proven wrongdoing undermines the seriousness of actual survivors' claims by training audiences to treat every allegation, true or false, the same way. What you can fairly say, and what's genuinely worth discussing, is this: megachurch structures, where one man is simultaneously CEO, spiritual authority, and often the final word on internal accountability, create real structural risk. When a religious commentator named Kelly Williams wrote about this exact situation, they made a point worth repeating. The inner workings of high-profile megachurches often create what they called a vacuum of accountability, especially when serious allegations surface. That's a structural critique, and it's one shared across denominations, not unique to any one pastor. So now the actual question this whole genre of video is built around: is Jakes preaching about church finances or secular deception as a coded shot at Winans, timed to distract from scrutiny of his own ministry? I want to be honest with you, I can't verify that, and I haven't found reporting that verifies it either. Here's why that matters. Pastors, all of them, across every denomination, preach about money, integrity, and secular influence constantly. It's one of the most common topics in American Christian preaching, full stop. A sermon touching on church finances or criticizing worldly culture is not, on its own, evidence of a coordinated response to a specific rival pastor's news cycle. To claim that connection, you'd need something concrete: the pastor naming names, a documented timeline showing the sermon was scheduled or altered in direct response to specific news, or on-record confirmation from someone inside the organization. Without that, he's throwing shade as an interpretation being applied to ambiguous material, which is worth naming plainly, because that's exactly the technique this whole genre of reaction content runs on. This doesn't mean every megachurch commentary channel is acting in bad faith. Plenty of them are engaging in real, useful accountability journalism, asking why donor money isn't more visible, why fundraising tactics feel coercive, why allegations against religious leaders take so long to get real institutional response. Those are legitimate questions. But there's a difference between let's examine documented financial opacity across megachurches and let's assume a specific unproven motive behind a specific sermon and build 40 minutes of content around that assumption. The first is journalism. The second is speculation wearing journalism's clothes, and it's worth being able to tell the two apart, especially when the person you're speculating about hasn't been convicted, charged, or even directly confronted with the specific claim on camera. If you want a genuinely useful lens here, it's this. Don't ask, is this pastor secretly plotting against that pastor? Ask, why does the structure of American megachurch finance make it so hard for ordinary members to know where their money goes, regardless of who's preaching? That question applies to Jakes, to Winans, to basically every large independent congregation in the country, and it's the one commentary channels rarely stick with. Because systemic transparency problem doesn't generate the same outrage clicks as pastor beefs with pastor. So where does that leave you, if you're someone who watched that original video and came here looking for the real story? A few practical things. First, if you attend a church, any denomination, you are entitled to ask reasonable questions about how money is spent. And a healthy leadership structure should be able to answer without treating the question as disloyalty. That's not radical, that's basic stewardship, and plenty of churches do this well. Second, when you see viral clips, the Winans donation moment is a perfect example. Wait for context before forming a permanent opinion. The instant version of a story and the fuller version, once both sides speak, are frequently different in meaningful ways, as we saw here. Third, hold two things at once when it comes to serious personal allegations against any religious leader. Take them seriously enough to not dismiss them, and be precise enough to not state them as proven fact before there's a legal or institutional finding. Survivors are better served by careful, accurate reporting than by outrage content that gets names wrong and blurs unrelated claims together. because sloppy coverage gives bad faith defenders an easy way to dismiss the whole thing as internet rumor. And fourth, maybe the most useful media literacy tool here, notice when a video's central question is phrased as "Is this person secretly doing X to hide Y?" That structure is designed to feel like investigation, while requiring no actual evidence to be satisfying. You can ask it about literally anyone, forever, regardless of what's true. The better question is always the boring one. What's actually documented? What's actually disputed? And what's just a rhetorical question dressed up as a discovery? Look, megachurch finance is a real, worthwhile subject. The lack of mandatory disclosure for religious nonprofits in this country is a genuine structural gap that affects millions of congregants who have no way to independently verify where their tithe money goes. Marvin Winans' fundraising approach and 2 decades of stalled construction are fair subjects for scrutiny. The allegations against Bishop Jakes are serious and deserve continued, careful reporting rather than either dismissal or premature conviction. What doesn't hold up is stitching all of that together into a single tidy narrative about one pastor secretly attacking another to cover his tracks, when the actual public record doesn't support that specific claim. The real story here isn't a beef, it's a structural one, about how much power and how little required transparency sits inside America's largest religious institutions, no matter who's standing at the pulpit. If you found this useful, the sourcing for everything in this video is in the description. Go check it yourself. That's kind of the whole point. And if you've got a megachurch finance question you want looked into properly, drop it below. I'll see you in the next one.